a judge ready to deliver his verdict. But just as the gavel is about to fall, a voice cuts through the silence. He's innocent. What starts as a simple trial soon unravels into a web of corruption, hidden truths, and a fight against those who control the system from the shadows. Clara Hayes wasn't supposed to be part of this story, but now, she's the only one who can expose the truth. What happens when justice itself is a lie? Stay till the end, because this case is far from over. Before we dive into this gripping story, ask yourself, what if the justice system wasn't about justice at all? What if the truth was buried and the people in power would do anything to keep it hidden? Stay with me till the end, because this isn't just a courtroom drama. It's a fight against corruption, deception, and a system built to protect the guilty. Like, share, and subscribe now, because once you hear this story, you'll never look at justice the same way again. Now let's begin. Every eye in the room was locked onto Judge Sullivan, a man whose face had never betrayed emotion, not once in his decades on the bench. He sat there, fingers resting on the polished wooden gavel, ready to bring it down and seal a fate that had been long in the making. Then, it happened. He's innocent. A single voice cut through the tension like a blade, clear, unwavering. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as heads turned toward the source. There she stood, Clara Hayes. Young, determined, standing tall in the middle of the crowd, her expression unreadable yet bold. Judge Sullivan's hand froze mid-air, the gavel hovering just inches above his desk. His face, usually composed, flickered with something foreign. Hesitation. A tremor ran through his fingers, subtle, but there. The weight of her words seemed to land on him harder than anyone else in the room. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The jury exchanged nervous glances. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. The defense attorney, who had been resigned to defeat just moments ago, now sat up straighter, as if a crack of light had suddenly split through a locked door. Clara didn't move. She didn't flinch under the weight of dozens of eyes boring into her. She had expected this reaction. She had counted on it. Judge Sullivan inhaled sharply, his grip tightening around the handle of the gavel. His lips parted, as if to say something, to reassert control over his own courtroom, but no words came. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain, and then, amidst the growing whispers and shifting tension, his gaze locked onto Clara's. Recognition flickered in his eyes. A realization. And just like that, the mask he had worn for so long cracked. The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. It was unraveling. 24 hours earlier, long before Clara Hayes shattered the silence of the courtroom, she sat hunched over a dimly lit desk in the back corner of the university law library. The air smelled of aged paper and dust, the kind of scent that clung to cases long forgotten. Her fingers traced the worn edges of an old case file, its pages brittle from years of neglect. The name on the cover barely caught her eye at first, just another injustice buried beneath stacks of newer, more urgent cases. But something about this one kept her turning the pages, kept her digging deeper. It was a case from 10 years ago. A man convicted of a crime he swore he didn't commit. The trial had been swift, the evidence conclusive. At least that's what the court had believed. But the more she read, the more a gnawing unease settled in her gut. Something didn't add up. The testimonies were inconsistent. The timeline was shaky. The lead detective's report had been hastily written, as if rushed to a conclusion. She chewed on her lip, flipping through the pages until something slipped from between them. A small, yellowed envelope, stuck to the back of a report. Inside was an old USB drive, its plastic casing cracked from years of neglect. No label, no indication of what was on it. Clara hesitated for only a second before plugging it into her laptop. A single audio file blinked on the screen. No timestamp, no name. She clicked play, Static filled her ears at first, then voices, muffled, tense. Just make sure it sticks. He's an easy target. A pause, a low chuckle. No loose ends. The voices faded into the hum of the background noise, but Clara's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. This wasn't just a recording. This was proof. Proof that the man sitting in prison had been framed. Proof that the real killer had never been caught. She yanked out the USB, her pulse racing. Someone had hidden this for a reason. Someone had wanted this case buried. Clara, don't. She turned sharply. Her mentor, Henry Lawson, stood in the doorway of the library's archives, his expression dark with something she rarely saw in his eyes. Fear. The retired detective looked as if he had aged 5 years just standing there. This isn't your fight, he warned, stepping closer. There are cases you walk away from. This is one of them. But Clara wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind. Not anymore, she said, gripping the USB in her palm. I have to do this. Lawson sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. He had seen that look before, on detectives who didn't know when to quit, on witnesses who thought the truth was enough to save them. Then you better be ready, he muttered, because once you step into this, there's no turning back. Clara met his gaze, unwavering. I never planned to turn back. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, the kind that hadn't yet fallen but hung heavy, waiting. Clara's footsteps echoed in the dimly lit alley behind the courthouse, her pulse matching the rhythm of her hurried steps. She scanned the shadows, searching for the man she was supposed to meet. Henry had warned her not to come alone, but she hadn't listened. She couldn't, not when she was this close. A shuffle to her left. A figure emerged from the darkness, a frail man with hunched shoulders, his janitor's uniform stained from years of labor. Martin. His eyes darted around nervously before settling on her. You're the girl asking questions. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Clara swallowed, her grip tightening around the strap of her bag. You were there the night of the murder. You saw something, didn't you? Martin exhaled sharply, rubbing a trembling hand over his face. I should have left it alone. Should have kept my mouth shut. He glanced around again, his fingers twitching. They told me if I talked, I wouldn't make it home one night. Clara's stomach twisted. Who told you that? He hesitated, as if weighing the price of the truth. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, battered USB drive. This. His hand shook as he pressed it into hers. This is what they wanted buried. Clara looked down at it, her breath catching. What's on it? Proof. His voice dropped lower, eyes flicking past her. But it won't mean anything if you're dead before you can use it. A chill ran down her spine. She turned instinctively, scanning the alley, but saw nothing but shifting shadows. When she turned back, Martin was gone. She spun, heart hammering. Martin! Silence. No trace of him, just the USB in her hand and the feeling that something had just changed. She didn't waste time. Sprinting through the empty streets, she headed straight for Henry's apartment, shoving past the half-broken door without knocking. Henry was waiting. He always was. He took one look at her face and sighed. What did you do? Clara tossed the USB onto the table, chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. Martin's gone. He gave me this. Henry picked it up carefully, turning it between his fingers. He didn't ask what was on it. He already knew. Clara. His voice was different this time, lower, more cautious. You need to walk away from this. She shook her head. I can't. This proves everything. Henry leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands. You think proof is enough? His eyes locked onto hers. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Clara's breath hitched at the look in his eyes. Fear, not just concern, not doubt, fear. And then, the unmistakable sensation crawled up her spine, that feeling of being watched. Slowly, she turned toward the window, toward the streetlights outside. A car was parked across the road, its engine off, its silhouette blending into the night. But the driver, he was staring right at her. The feeling wouldn't leave her. That sinking weight in her chest, the itch at the back of her neck like unseen eyes crawling over her skin. Clara kept her pace steady, her breath even, but she could hear them, the footsteps. Not too close, not too far. Just enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. She took a sharp turn down an empty street, her hands balled into fists in her jacket pockets. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the dim glow of flickering streetlights. She quickened her pace. So did they. Her heart pounded. Another turn. A dead-end alley. Clara spun around fast, ready to confront whoever was behind her. Nothing. No one. The street behind her stretched empty and silent, as if she had imagined it all. She swallowed hard, forcing her pulse to slow. Maybe Henry was right. Maybe she was in over her head. Then her phone buzzed. She didn't recognize the number, but somehow she knew. With shaking fingers, she answered. A voice. Low, smooth, almost amused. Some secrets are better left buried. Clara's blood turned to ice. The line went dead. Her grip tightened around the phone. Number. They weren't going to scare her off. Not now. Not when she was this close. If she hesitated, if she backed down now, the judge would announce the verdict, and an innocent man would spend the rest of his life behind bars. She had no choice. She had to act fast. The courthouse archives were locked, but locks were meant to be broken. Clara moved through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps silent against the marble floor. The records room was in the basement, cold, forgotten, filled with the weight of 1,000 buried truths. She reached the door, hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she slipped inside. Rows of filing cabinets loomed around her, stretching into the darkness. She moved quickly, scanning labels, searching for the case. Then, there, a cabinet marked confidential. Clara's fingers worked fast, yanking open the drawers, rifling through thick manila folders. And then she saw it. A file labeled Judge Sullivan. Her stomach clenched as she flipped it open. Bank statements, offshore accounts, memos between high-ranking officials, and at the bottom, an old photograph. A younger Judge Sullivan, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man Clara didn't recognize. But the name below it made her breath catch. Victor Langley. The name meant nothing to her. But the weight of it, the way it was tucked away in a classified file, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a corrupt judge. This was something bigger, something deeper. And if she was right, Judge Sullivan wasn't making his own decisions. He was taking orders. The courtroom was suffocating with tension, the air thick with expectation, with finality. Judge Sullivan sat tall, his gavel poised, ready to deliver the verdict that would decide a man's fate. The jury's eyes were locked on him. The defense attorney sat rigid, knowing they had already lost. The prosecutor, smug, folded his hands on the table, waiting for the inevitable. Then, Clara stood. Wait. The words sliced through the silence like a blade. Every head turned. Every murmur hushed. Judge Sullivan's gaze snapped to her, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Ms. Hayes, you are not a part of these proceedings. But I have evidence, she cut in, her voice steady, unwavering. Evidence that proves this entire case was rigged. The prosecutor scoffed. This is highly inappropriate. Clara ignored him. She reached into her bag, pulling out the USB drive. This contains a recording, a conversation between two people, one of whom is sitting in this courtroom right now. Judge Sullivan's fingers curled around the gavel. Ms. Hayes, I will not tolerate— You should hear it first, she interrupted, stepping toward the courtroom's projector. Because once you do, you won't have a choice. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara didn't wait for permission. She plugged in the USB, and the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, dark, the voices slightly muffled. But the words, "We need this case closed. He takes the fall, and the problem disappears. And if someone digs, they won't. Not if they know what's good for them." A sharp inhale rippled through the courtroom. The video continued. The faces weren't clear, but the voices. One of them was unmistakable. Judge Sullivan's. A ripple of gasps spread through the room. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Reporters scrambled to take notes. At the bench, Judge Sullivan's face had gone pale. His grip on the gavel tightened as if holding on to the last shred of control. "That recording is inadmissible," he said, his voice measured but strained. Clara turned to him, eyes blazing. "You would know, wouldn't you?" The judge flinched. The prosecutor stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. This so-called evidence is unverified. There is no proof." "The proof," Clara shot back, "is in the voices, and every single person in this room just heard it." Judge Sullivan exhaled sharply. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white. "Enough," he said, his voice lower this time. Clara didn't back down. "Is it?" she asked, stepping closer, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Because I think we're just getting started." The courtroom was no longer a place of order. It was unraveling, slipping out of Judge Sullivan's control like sand through his fingers. The weight of the recording still hung in the air, pressing down on everyone like a force that couldn't be ignored. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. The defense attorney, stunned into silence, finally had something to hold on to. The prosecutor's smugness had vanished, replaced by a thinly veiled panic as he rifled through his notes, searching for a way to crush what had just been revealed. And then the doors opened. A hush fell over the room as two uniformed officers stepped inside, flanking a man who looked like he had aged a decade overnight. Martin. The janitor's frail frame looked even smaller beneath the fluorescent lights, his hands twitching at his sides. His eyes darted across the room, landing on Clara for only a second before shifting to the judge. And that was when it happened. Judge Sullivan stiffened, his grip on the gavel tightening. He knew. The bailiff led Martin to the stand, where he lowered himself into the seat, shoulders hunched, as if he was bracing for a storm. The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat. "This is highly irregular. We have no indication that this witness has any relevance to—" "I saw it," Martin interrupted, his voice quiet but clear. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence, his lips parting slightly as if he'd misheard. Martin swallowed hard, his fingers curling around the edges of the witness stand. "I saw what really happened that night, and I kept quiet because I was told if I didn't, I'd never make it home." The murmurs turned into hushed gasps. Someone in the jury leaned forward. The prosecutor forced a smile. "Mr. Coleman, you are under oath. If you are implying—" "I'm not implying anything," Martin cut in, his voice stronger now. He turned his gaze toward the defendant, the man who had spent 10 years behind bars. "That man didn't kill anyone." Chaos erupted. The defense attorney shot to his feet. The jury whispered among themselves, eyes wide. The judge slammed his gavel once, then twice, but this time, it wasn't enough to silence the room. Clara watched as the prosecutor scrambled to regain control, flipping through paperwork that suddenly felt worthless. He had spent the entire trial constructing an airtight case, only to watch it crumble in a matter of minutes. Martin exhaled sharply. His eyes, sunken with years of regret, finally lifted toward the bench. The man who did it is still out there. Judge Sullivan's mask cracked. It was in his hands, the way they twitched despite his best efforts to keep them still. It was in his eyes, the slight widening that betrayed recognition. It was in the rigid set of his jaw, the way he refused to meet Martin's gaze. Clara didn't need a confession to know the truth. The judge knew exactly who the real killer was. And for the first time since this trial began, the courtroom knew it too. The courtroom was spiraling out of control. The weight of Martin's confession, the damning recording, the judge's pale, rigid expression, everything was unraveling faster than anyone could contain. Judge Sullivan sat motionless for a moment, his face unreadable, his fingers tightening around the gavel as if it were the last thing anchoring him. Then, in a voice too steady for the chaos around him, he said, "This court is adjourned." The words barely had time to settle before he slammed the gavel down. But Clara saw it, the flicker of something in his eyes. Not frustration, not defeat, something sharper, something planned. And then the side door burst open. The first man through was dressed in black, moving fast, then another and another, their movements precise, controlled, not panicked by the courtroom's chaos, but fueled by something else. Purpose. Clara's stomach dropped. They weren't here to make an arrest. They were here to bury the truth. The bailiff reached for his weapon, but he wasn't fast enough. One of the intruders slammed him against the desk, sending his gun skidding across the floor. The jury scattered, some ducking beneath their seats, others frozen in shock. The prosecutor stepped back, his face twisting into confusion, then fear. He hadn't seen this coming either. Clara did the only thing she could. She grabbed the USB from the evidence table and bolted. "Clara!" Henry's voice rang out from across the room, but she was already moving, weaving through the chaos, Martin struggling to keep up at her side. "Stop them!" one of the armed men barked, his voice cutting through the commotion like a whip. Clara shoved past a row of reporters, knocking over a camera in the process. The footage wouldn't matter if they didn't get out of there alive. Clara wasn't done. Not even close. If you think justice was served, think again. Corruption runs deeper than we can imagine, and the fight for the truth never truly ends. What would you do if you uncovered a secret that powerful people wanted buried? Would you walk away, or would you risk everything to expose it? Let us know in the comments, because sometimes the most dangerous stories are the ones that need to be told. And if you want more gripping tales of truth, power, and deception, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The next story might be even closer to reality than you think.